All right, we're ready to start looking at some of the muscles. We're going to start with the shoulder, and we're going to start with the scapular stabilizers. One of the things I really recommend in learning all of the anatomy is to make flashcards. Really, you can do this any way that feels most helpful to you. What I recommend is having a picture of some sort on one side, which might be cut and pasted from whatever source you prefer, and then writing some of the details, the action, the origin, insertion, maybe poses that can help you remember some of the more intricate details along the way. Really, it's a learning resource for yourself though, so how you make them is up to you to make a really comfortable learning tool that you can refer back to. One of the challenges that I find teachers struggle with most is getting the information in their head. So I really recommend just picking one or two of those note cards a week to come back to so that you can learn them over time. One thing that's really helpful when you're learning anatomy is to really stick to the basics. So as we go through this, I'm going to really cut out the most important points, and then I'll use some descriptions to help create a picture of the muscles so that you can remember it. But really the things that you want to take away from this are going to be very simple. The action is going to be the most important, and the yoga poses will also be very important. The origin and insertion are really there to help you learn kind of where the muscle is, how to palpate it, how to connect with it. But as a yoga teacher, memorizing all of the origin and insertions won't be that helpful. Knowing them, though, will also help us understand the action. So remember, the really main points we want to look at is what does this muscle do? How does it show up in a yoga practice? And if memorizing the origin and insertion help you to get there, by all means, memorize away. So let's start with the scapular stabilizers. And the first one's going to be one that's probably more familiar to you. We're going to look at the rhomboids, and we have a rhomboid major and a rhomboid minor, but we can think of them as one muscle because really they're going to have a very similar origin and insertion. So the rhomboid minor is going to be a smaller version superior to the rhomboid major, being much larger underneath it. These are going to go from C7 to T5, so in the upper part of the back, the upper part of the thoracic spine, to the medial border of the scapula. So they're going to go in this orientation. You can see a nice picture in your manual as well as you follow along. As you can imagine, so if I think about this muscle going from the thoracic spine to the medial border of the shoulder blade, all I have to think about is the action that's going to happen as I pull those 2 points toward each other. So unfortunately, Fred's scapula is screwed to his rib cage, so his won't move. But you can imagine if the scapula was free floating here and I shortened the muscle fibers here in between, this shortening of the rhomboids is going to retract or draw the shoulder blades toward each other. And this is that motion we think about in a yoga practice as this heart-opening motion, drawing my shoulder blades back toward each other to open the chest, open the heart, as I retract the shoulder blades. Now we also talked about this muscle as being part of the scapular stability. And we'll come back to that, but know that the rhomboids are also part of the stability of the scapula in itself, as it helps to tether the scapula or tie down the scapula to the spine. So it makes a connection to the axial skeleton. So we're going to think about 2 actions for each muscle. First, we're going to talk about poses that shorten this muscle or contract this muscle. And then we'll talk about poses that lengthen. Now, the tricky thing to this is that there are many times when we see a muscle shortening that it might not necessarily be strengthening or activated. It might be passively shortening. So in your own practice and in your own way, you can also consider when this muscle might get tired. When is it really actively contracting and shortening to strengthen the muscle? What poses will actually strengthen this muscle? Versus when is the muscle stretching? And again, there might be some poses that you personally might not feel as much of a stretch as someone else who maybe is a little bit tighter. But I want to think about what postures are going to stretch the muscle. So with the rhomboids, what I'm thinking of is any kind of posture that's going to draw the shoulder blades back. So again, we're looking for anything that's going to retract the scapula. So one that comes to mind really quickly is something like Ustrasana or camel pose, where I'm trying to draw the shoulder blades back to come into my back bend. In fact, on that note, many of the back bends will create this quality as well. Think about any back bends where my arms are more along my sides rather than up overhead. And you'll really see that exaggerated with the arms by the sides. So Dhanurasana or wheel pose, as well as potentially dancer's pose, grabbing the ankle there. We can also think about this in something like bridge pose, clasping the hands behind the back. Now we get into one that potentially may or may not get tired there. If I'm able to clasp my hands and just hold my arms there, I might not feel a lot in my rhomboids. But if I'm actively drawing my shoulder blades back, I'm probably going to feel a little bit more. So what you'll notice as you experiment with this in your own practice is some of it does depend on the style of yoga you practice, the cues that you use, the awareness that you bring into the pose, that there are potentially many different things happening in any one pose, and maybe some things that aren't naturally happening within the pose. So arm variations are going to be a big part of this. Anytime I have variations with my arms or my shoulder blades retracting, one of my favorite is cactus arms, drawing the shoulder blades back. Again, I could take my arms up into a cactus shape and do very little with my rhomboids, or I could think about really actively drawing them back to think about the rhomboids actively engaging to retract my scapula. Another one we could think about is reverse tabletop, taking the hands behind me. Again, I could come up into reverse tabletop and let my shoulders shrug forward and get very little of that, or I could prepare on my seat, draw the shoulder blades back first, and come into it and keep some of that retraction. So again, it's not always a given, but in many of these positions where we really actively retract the shoulder blades, we'll feel that engagement of the rhomboids. And really anytime we're thinking about this heart opening in general, this chest opening will be. Now, when we put this together with the next muscle we're going to look at, we'll understand how this helps to support the stability of the scapula. But for right now, notice that it also says in your manual, any weight-bearing poses. So anytime I'm bearing weight on my arms, potentially, ideally, this muscle is firing to help support and stabilize the scapula. Now, poses that will stretch this one. There's a few that come to mind really quickly. One of which you might be familiar with, Garudasana. Again, anything that's going to do the opposite, so protracting. Think about cat pose, think about crow pose, think about Garudasana. Anything that's stretching the skin between the shoulder blades is going to be stretching the rhomboids there. Now, the next one we're going to look at in this series, and what we're looking at, remember, are the scapular stabilizers. We're looking at muscles that stabilize the scapula here. So the first one we looked at was the rhomboids, again, a little bit more familiar. The next one we're going to look at is serratus anterior. And important to put that anterior on there because we do have a serratus posterior superior, posterior inferior. So knowing that it's that serratus anterior does distinguish it from the other two. Now when we look at serratus anterior, the name comes from the serrations, or these little kind of teeth-like projections that attach to the ribs here. And in your manual you can see the picture of the outline of the serratus anterior and the side of the ribs, those kind of serrations or projections of the muscle that attach to each of the ribs there. So these are going to attach to the upper 8 or 9 ribs. And remember, some of these will be different from person to person. A lot of these, I think the interesting thing when we look at the anatomy, a lot of times there is a range because it can vary from person to person. So when we look at this, what we'll see is the serrations of the muscle attaching to this lateral surface of the rib cage. And then the tricky thing about this one is it's going to go between the scapula and the rib cage to insert on the medial border of the rib cage here. So you have to imagine it going right in between to connect to that medial border. So what that means is if I look at the serratus anterior, and again, I think of it going from the side of the ribs to the medial border of the scapula, and I think about drawing those 2 points toward each other, my scapula is going to start to move into protraction, meaning that it's going to move around my rib cage so that my scapula comes forward rather than backward. This action of protraction rather than retraction. So if you were to think about this in like cat-cow, or even just standing at a wall, as I push the floor of the wall away, there's that protraction and that space increasing between the shoulder blades here, rather than if I move the other way and draw the shoulder blades together. So serratus tends to be the one that's a little bit more vague. In fact, it looks like a really big muscle, but it's actually a very thin sheet of muscle. So the activation of this muscle feels pretty small. And we'll look at palpation and specifics when we get into the palpation segment of this as well. But for now, consider this covering the sides of your ribs, attaching to the medial border of the scapula, and its main function is to protract the scapula. In fact, one of probably the primary functions of this muscle is actually simply to stabilize the scapula. So if you look at this and consider here from this side view, you can kind of see it a little bit better. If you imagine that it's attaching to the side of the ribs, to the medial border of the scapula, you can think about this literally pulling the scapula onto the back. We talk about this a lot in yoga as scapular winging, where the medial border of the scapula sticks up off of the back and you can kind of see some space in between the scapula and the rib cage. And the serratus anterior is one of the primary muscles that helps to decrease that winging, helps to eliminate that winging by literally pulling the scapula forward onto the rib cage here. And it's hard to show because clearly I'm going between the scapula and the rib cage, but I'm grabbing onto that inner border of the scapula to pull it forward. So a really important one with the rhomboids, but probably even more important for that scapular stability because it's pulling the scapula onto the back to help create that support. So if you imagine here, say my little clicker here is the scapula, right? And I've got my serratus pulling the scapula one way, I've got my rhomboids pulling the scapula the other way, right? So this one shortens. Now let's move it off of Fred and imagine, right, I've got my serratus here as one arm pulling the scapula around the rib cage, and I've got my rhomboids here as the other arm pulling the scapula toward the spine. You can imagine them playing this kind of tug of war. In fact, if you were to look in a cadaver, what you'd see is that it's almost continuous. This line of musculature from the rib cage taps down on the medial border of the scapula and then just continues to the spine. We like to call them separate muscles, but clearly we could also call them one and the same. But it's nice, it's handy to have separate names because they do have such separate functions. So when we look at this, the serratus is pulling it one way, the rhomboids are pulling it the other, but in order to stabilize the scapula, they simply both have to pull equally. And it doesn't need to be a lot. This isn't this bicep power. This isn't this motive force, this movement of the superficial muscles. But the stability, remember, is that cohesion to be able to just lightly turn on the muscles to support the scapula. This is really important because the humerus is further out the chain. So all of the stability and movement of the humerus is dependent on the stability of the scapula and the movement of the scapula. So this is a really critical hinging point to lose or gain stability. And in fact, if I lose my stability here, I'm going to lose some at the humerus as well. And the muscles that we look at next are going to have to work even harder. So serratus is going to protract, rhomboids are going to retract. Together, they turn on to stabilize the scapula to work as a team. So now when we look at poses, we could pretty much switch what we looked at for the rhomboids, remember, because these are antagonists. Remember that word we talked about as opposing musculature? My rhomboids are the antagonist to my serratus. My serratus is the antagonist to my rhomboids. So poses that will strengthen the serratus are going to be poses that would stretch the rhomboids. So when we looked at some of the poses coming into cat pose or crow pose, that protraction that we're creating here will potentially strengthen the serratus. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen crow pose where people didn't necessarily protract the rib cage. So again, it depends on the actual action that's happening. One of my favorites is just scapular push-ups to get both of them, where I'm either in plank with my knees down or my knees up, where I'm just moving the shoulder blades back and forth. And you'll get a chance to experience this later. but you can feel this movement back and forth in relation to gravity as a great way to strengthen, especially serratus. So scapular push-ups are a great one, cat pose, crow pose, and again, ideally anytime I'm weight bearing, these muscles should be functioning properly to hold the scapula on the back. If the scapula is winging, I know there's probably something that's not functioning properly there as I ask my student to weight bear on their arms. Now clearly I don't need that when I'm standing upright. My arms should be able to move, my scapula should be able to move. I'm not worried about winging until I put weight on my hands. And that's when these muscles have to turn on to support me automatically, ideally, so that the shoulder has that stability. So to stretch the serratus anterior, again, it's the opposite. Everything that was strengthening the rhomboids before is going to be stretching the serratus. So all these heart openers we looked at, reverse tabletop, Dhanurasana, Ustrasana, bridge pose, all of these will be stretching the serratus. Though it might not be where you feel the most stretch. For many of us, we'll feel it more in our chest. You may or may not feel a lot happening here in the serratus, but theoretically, we will be lengthening the tissues there. Now, remember, the key to this to take away is that when we look at these functions, the rhomboids and the serratus are really meant to stabilize the scapula. So it's not that we need huge movements to turn them on or big muscular efforts, but there's some awareness around them turning on to help stabilize, to make this joint move more efficiently. And if it's not, I probably need to back up and look at some really simple poses to connect to that.